everyone, hope you're doing well. Today's video is going to be a little bit longer than some of the other definition videos because we're going to cover listed and labeled, but we're also going to cover identified, which kind of gets confused with listed a lot of times. And we're also going to talk about field labeled and field evaluation bodies. So to start out, when we talk about listed, a lot of people kind of have a general idea of what listed means. They have a product and there's a label on it, and that means it's listed and we're happy. And, you know, if that's the extent of your knowledge of listing, that's okay. We're here to change that. The definition of listed in the NEC actually means this. It means equipment or materials that's included in a list that's published by an organization concerned with product evaluation. Okay, so it's a product that's in a list somewhere. So what is the list? Well, what we would find today, of course, we would go online and we would look at a website like UL Product IQ. That might be the most well-known list, at least in the United States. So I go to UL Product IQ. It's a free site. You do need to create an account, just a username and password, but I highly recommend doing it. So if I'm looking for a particular product and I want to find out if it's listed, I have a piece of support hardware, for example, and it's manufactured by Rayco. I would search for it and I can look and I can see that model numbers 2058 and 2059, those are listed. And if I want to get a little bit more information on it, I can get the confirmation letter from UL that basically says, yes, this is a listed product. Or I can go to the guide information, what we call the category card, and you can get some general requirements for conduit and cable hardware, so supporting hardware. So listed means that your product is in a list, but that list has to be published by somebody that's concerned with product evaluation. Now that might be UL, it could be Intertek, it could be Met Labs or CSA or TUV or FM approvals. There's a bunch of different testing laboratories. We don't require that you use UL. UL is probably just the most popular one in the United States. Definitely not the most popular throughout the globe. So UL is one testing laboratory, but there are other testing laboratories as well. So if I'm a manufacturer and I want to get my product listed, how do I do that? Well, I would manufacture my product and I would send it to the certifying body, right? The testing organization, UL, Intertek, whoever. And what they're going to do is they're going to determine whether or not a product standard exists. Okay, so a product standard gives out the details of what it takes to become a listed product. So what we do is we have what are called standards technical panels. And that's a group of individuals that help to write or revise the product standards for different types of equipment. Now, I'm on a few different standard technical panels for UL, and I want to be very clear on this. I'm not speaking on behalf of UL. I don't have the authority to, and I wouldn't want to anyway. Everything I'm saying is just my own opinion, so I want to throw that out there really fast. But if we go to a UL standard, this is UL 489, for example, the standard for molded case circuit breakers. If I am a circuit breaker manufacturer, I'm going to buy a copy of this standard. Now, you can buy a copy of all of UL standards, and you can also view them for free. Now, I say view them, but not download them. If you go to shopulstandards.com, you can click on them and you can view them for free. You can't copy and paste, you can't search, you can't do any of that stuff. If you want that much interaction, then you need to purchase the standard. So if I'm a manufacturer of circuit breakers, I'm going to buy UL 489. That's not even an option. I'm going to buy UL 489. And if you can see it, it's 330 pages. And it basically lays out what's required in order to have a circuit breaker tested and listed. Now, I can't share the document, obviously, but we can kind of look at the table of contents together. That's going to be, fair use. So for molded case circuit breakers, it's going to tell you how to build them, corrosion protection, current carrying parts, operating mechanisms, current limiting, not current limiting. How long does it have to hold at a percentage of its long time pickup rating? All of these different things. So 330 pages worth of information that you would have to satisfy in order to have your circuit breaker listed. So I'm a circuit breaker manufacturer. I build a breaker, I get a copy of UL 489, and I want to make sure that I meet all the tests, and I think I do, so I send it off to a testing laboratory. They do all of the testings required by the product standard, and if you pass, then they will list your product, which means what? That means your name gets put in a list. So now my name is on a list, right? My product is on a list. So that means I have a listed product. Now, how would the inspector know that it's a listed product? Or for that matter, how would an electrician or anybody know that it's a listed product? Usually, the way we would do that is we're looking for a label. And there's actually an informational note here in Article 100 to the definition of listed that says, look, ways of indicating that a product is listed could vary, and some testing laboratories don't consider the product listed unless it's also labeled. Okay, so ways of indicating it vary, and it could include labeling. Well, what's labeling? Well, labeling is that little sticker right there. It says UL listed. Now, is that the listing? No. The listing is in the list. This is the label. So we look at the definition of labeled. Labeled is equipment or materials with a label or a symbol or similar mark of a product testing evaluation company indicating compliance with appropriate product standards. All right, so these twist-on wire connectors happen to be listed by UL, and they're listed by CSA. Now, it's important to understand some of the different marks and some of the different testing organizations. UL by itself just says UL. That means it's good for the United States. And here this sticker says CSA. Well, CSA stands for the Canadian Standards Association. So if it says CSA, we need to make sure that it's not just compliant in Canada. If we're using it in the United States, we need to make sure that it's listed for use in the United States as well. You see, it could be two different product standards. There could be a product standard for Canada and a different product standard for the United States. And the fact that you passed the test prescribed in the Canadian standard don't necessarily mean that you would pass the test prescribed in the US standard. So we need to know our certifying bodies, and we need to know where they're located. If I have a product that's listed by TÜV, for example, well, you know, TÜV, I believe, is headquartered in Germany. We want to make sure that whatever product we're using is not just listed, but listed for use under the codes and standards that we're going to be installing them to. So these products are labeled. It's worth kind of remembering what the product labels look like. If you just see UL listed with a Sharpie, that's probably not a listed product, so we want to make sure we know what the UL mark is, what the ETL mark is, the Intertek mark, and the FM labs, especially if you're doing hazardous locations. They do a lot of hazardous locations testing. So all of the different testing laboratories have different marks, and we do kind of need to familiarize ourselves with what those marks look like. In the 2020 code, they added an informational note to the definition of labeled, which I think was quite good. It just tells us, look, for small parts or parts with unusual shapes or surfaces, the label is often found on the box that the product is packaged in. And in fact, if you go to UL Product IQ, it'll tell you where to find the label. It might say that it's either on the product itself or in the smallest shipping container, I think is what they call it. So the smallest box that they can put it in. So you're not going to find an actual embossed mark on each of these compression connectors. There's just no reason for that. So what you'll have instead is you'll have the label on the box itself. Just like with our twist-on wire connectors here. Obviously, you're not going to have a little label on every one of these wire connectors. You're just going to put it on the jar that it comes in. So that's listed and labeled. So I send the product off. It goes through the whole gamut of testing, and it passes the test, and I feel pretty confident that that piece of equipment is going to be safe, right? That's the whole idea behind listing, is to ensure that the product is going to behave in a safe manner. What if I don't have a listed product? Well, first of all, not everything in the code has to be listed. A lot of things do have to be listed, but a lot of things don't. Under the 2020 code, believe it or not, circuit breakers don't have to be listed. I think as an inspector, I would expect to see a listed circuit breaker, but in the NEC, it's not necessarily required. There are other products that can't be listed because there's not a product standard yet. You know, when energy storage systems first came out, it took a little while to develop a standard. And before that standard was developed, you couldn't possibly list it. If you manufactured an energy storage system and you sent it off to Intertek or somebody and you said, hey, test this and list it, they'd send it back and say, well, what test do you want me to run on it? There's no product standard. So if there's no product standard, then the product might not be listed. Or what if you get a product that's from overseas? You know, sometimes, and you see this with high-end residential. You know, the homeowner will go on a trip to Italy or somewhere and they see this chandelier in a museum that they fall in love with and they're going to spend $100,000 on it and another $20,000 to ship it home. That thing's not going to be listed. 410.6 in the NEC says luminaires have to be listed. So what's a person to do? Well, listed is listed. There is no equivalent. There's no substitute for listing. Either it's listed or it's not. But most inspectors will consider a field evaluation and a field labeled product to be good enough instead of a listing. So field evaluation and field labeling, it's not the same as listing. And if your inspector says, hey, the code says listed, it's got to be listed. Well, then your inspector's right, even if you do have a field label. But sometimes we will go ahead and get the services of a field evaluation body so that we can have a field evaluation and a field label. So what's a field evaluation body? Well, that's an organization that performs field evaluations on electrical equipment. And there's a whole bunch of different field evaluation bodies. CSA, ETL, Intertek, Met Labs, TUV, FM, UL, there's a bunch of them. And in fact, if you want to really find kind of the de facto list of certified testing bodies and what OSHA calls nationally recognized testing laboratories, go to OSHA's website, search for NRTL, Nationally Recognized Testing Laboratory, or NRTL. And there is a whole bunch of different bodies that will do field evaluations and product testing. So that's the field evaluation body. I would hire a field evaluation body to perform a field evaluation and hopefully get a field label applied. So I want you to take a look at these two different marks. These are from my friends at Intertek. If you have a listed product, this is the label that they would apply. If you had a field evaluated product, this is the label that they would apply. So I buy that luminaire, right, that $20,000 chandelier. And well, I don't buy it. I have to install it. let's get real. I have to install it. I call up my friends at Intertek and I say, listen, can you come out here and do a field evaluation? They come out there and they test the luminaire and they do everything that they possibly can in the field. And they do their evaluation and they say, look, we think that this product would probably meet the product standard if we could do all of the required testing. We can't because that might involve destroying the product, so we can't do everything to it, but we feel very confident that if we could, it would be safe. So we'll apply a field label on it, right? So ETL is going to put their field label, or UL, or whoever you hire. Field labeled equipment is equipment with a label, symbol, or similar mark of a field evaluation body indicating that the product was evaluated and complies with the requirements described in a field evaluation report. All right, so there you go. That would be a field labeled piece of equipment. It's not listed, it's not equivalent to listed, but most inspectors would agree that field labeled equipment is good enough if the code requires listed. The last thing that we have is a term called identified, and boy, this one I think gets misused a lot in the NEC. In fact, I would say it's the most misused defined term in the entire codebook. Identified isn't held to the same standard as listed. Okay, so if I have an identified product, it doesn't necessarily have to be listed. If the code says it shall be identified, what it means is it has to be recognized as suitable for a specific purpose, function, use, environment, etc., where described in a code rule. So for example, if I open up the code book and I go to section 406.9b, as in boy, I'm going to find out that these outlet hoods have to be a listed product, but not only do they have to be listed, they have to be identified as extra duty. Okay, so has to be listed, that's one thing, but the product standard for these outlet hoods might not detail what extra duty means. So it's a listed product, but it might not be strong enough to hold up to the kind of abuse that these things normally get. So we don't want it to just be listed. We also want it to be identified as extra duty, which again means recognized as suitable. So how do I recognize that it's suitable? Well, the manufacturer could mark it and say, look, this is extra duty. And if that's the case, then in my opinion, that would be identified as extra duty. So identified doesn't mean marked necessarily. There are other ways to identify the suitability of the product. It might just be in the manufactured literature. Does it have to be marked extra duty? No. But maybe in the box that it came in, it says extra duty, or in the product literature, it says extra duty. That might be another way of identifying the product. There's an informational note that says some ways to determine identification include investigations by a testing laboratory or an inspection agency or by other organization concerned with product evaluations. I think at the end of the day, what they're really trying to say here with identified is you have approved in Article 100. Approved is whatever the inspector will accept. Listed, well, we know what listed means. That means it went through the test and everything else. I think somewhere in the middle we have identified. Let me give you an example. 240.15 talks about circuit breaker handle ties, the little piece of plastic that might tie two single pole breakers together. Now, does that have to be a listed piece of plastic? No. I mean, why would I have to you're going to send it and test it? I mean, what tests are you even going to run on a little piece of plastic? And is it necessary? Probably not. But we don't want it to just be an approved handle tie, because the inspector could theoretically approve anything. You know, you want to use some bubble gum to hold the two breakers together. That could be approved. Probably wouldn't be. But, you know, could I use a piece of 12-gauge wire to tie those two breakers together? Might be approved. Obviously not listed. And it's probably not identified. Because, again, identified means it's recognized as being suitable for that application. Well, right now in the 2020 code, it doesn't really say who does the judging to recognize whether it's suitable. So right now, you know, could be the AHJ, could be a testing laboratory, could be an inspection agency. I think in the 2023 code, we're going to try to clear this up a little bit. But for right now, I think you'll be in good shape if you try to remember that identified is somewhere between approved and listed. Be sure to like, follow, subscribe, and ring the bell.